Ford versus Ferrari, Yankees versus Red Sox, pizza versus sushi. Rivalries are fun, and Rolex collectors are a competitive bunch. Sometimes you gain greater perspective and enjoyment of your Rolex watch by understanding how it compares to a worthy rival from another major watchmaker. Well, today we are taking 6 Rolex watches, past and present, and explaining how they relate to formidable alternatives from other watchmakers. We're not playing favorites. This may be a Rolex show, but today we're comparing the best with the rest and letting you decide which is which. Mike, what have you got for me?
So our first rival of the day is kind of one of my all-time favorite and classic Rolexes, the Submariner, and specifically the 5513. Now this was a watch they made from the early 60s right through the late 80s. So I think it was a 27-year run, just an incredibly long run for a reference. And it really became probably one of the most iconic Rolexes, but also the most iconic dive watch in the world. When you think about a dive watch nowadays, you think of a black rotating bezel, you think of the black dial, you think of a bracelet. Everything that Rolex kind of became, without a date, kind of became a signature Submariner thing. But back in the day, and I remember, in the early to mid 70s, working for my dad, who was a watchmaker, his big thing was Omega. And Omega made some of the coolest sports watches back in the day, and they made a professional diving watch, the Plo Prof. They still make variations of it today. Was an incredibly different and unusual dive watch that I don't know if it was so exciting of the day, but technically advanced, really heavy, just super durable. And Omega back then was probably more popular than Rolex.
Yeah, without a doubt, Omega is the natural rival. I think the Seamaster line, being as broad as it is an interesting comparison because the 5513 came out during the Eisenhower era and 3 years before James Bond in Dr. No hit the big screen. But at the same time, the watch went out of production only 5 years before Pierce Brosnan started playing James Bond. So you can pick any Seamaster from this era. I'm going to say 16514. Minimally beveled Seamaster 300 from the early 60s. I think that's a great rival to your early 5513. I think it's a fun comparison. Also interesting that they did battle, so to speak, in a literal sense, as they were both purchased by the Royal Armed Forces of Britain.
Right.
So you had the 5513/0, a military Submariner, and there was also a military Seamaster, the 165024, during that mid-60s time frame. So they did battle on the civilian market. Eventually, they would do battle on screen, and of course, they did battle in the military market for service-issued timepieces. What's really fascinating is that it's almost as though we've seen the battle rejoined today.
Yes.
Because if you look at the current no-date sub, as it came out last year, and you look at the Seamaster 300 from Omega as it was redesigned last year, you've got these two retro resonance watches that look a lot like they did in the mid-60s. It's almost bringing back the rivalry between the Seamaster 300 and what was at the time the 5513.
And I think what's interesting with Omega is they did so many variations, and it was such a broad line, where Rolex did just the opposite. Every Submariner looked the same. They really never went off. Yes, they varied a little with the Sea Dweller, and they did a couple of things, but it really looks exactly the same. And now Omega has come back to that. I think it's true. I think it's the closest natural rival to a Rolex. And again, back then in the 70s and even in the early 80s, Rolex was not the biggest thing in the planet like it is today. Today, everybody thinks watches, thinks Rolex, and Omega's really made a comeback in the last 5 or 6 years.
And especially during that mid-60s period when you would have had something like a 16524 against a 5513, it was actually Omega that from a sales standpoint had the upper hand back then.
Without a doubt. It was much more well known. They had the Moon Watch, which we'll get to in our next talking points, but they really became famous for that.
Also important to note is that if you are buying them on today's market, there are some features of the Seamaster that make it a little bit more appealing to modern taste, especially the 16524 with, what would be called the professional case or the lyre lug case. It's a bigger watch. It's a 42 versus, a 5513 being like a 39 at the time. So it wears much more modern if you buy those watches today.
I completely agree.
Now, kind of stepping from one Rolex versus Omega rivalry to another, this is a ready-made set piece, guys. The Daytona, mid-60s, the pre-moon moon watches. Let me know what you've got for me.
So again, the Daytona back then, I brought up the 6240 because it was kind of the next evolution, but the 6238s even so, they really went head to head against the Speedmaster, and most famously with NASA. So NASA needed a watch for their flight missions. They went out and tested a bunch of watches and ended up picking the Omega over the Rolex. Now today you look back, and if you have one of those original Rolexes, obviously the Daytona's one of the most famous watches in the world, one of the most valuable watches in the world, but at the time was considered by NASA and a lot of other people second fiddle to that Rolex Daytona, which was, a little less reliable, had some issues mechanically. The screw down pushers became cumbersome.
More expensive.
Much more expensive, and for a lot of reasons was nowhere near as popular as that Omega.
Now these watches are a lot more comparable than they seem at face value. We even use some of the same terminology. We have pre-Daytonas like the 6238. We have pre-Moon Speedmaster professionals. We have two manual wind chronographs in an era when that was the rule from two of the premier houses in watchmaking. The watches were fascinating because at the time it was also a bit of a surrogate battle, as you had Valjoux inside the Rolex and you had La Manna inside the Omega. Right. And they were both great products, but especially once 1965, 1964 rolls around, we start to see both of these watches evolving. We get the 10512, which is the first of the Speedmaster professionals, and we also get the watch you mentioned, the 6240, which is the first of the screw-down crown oyster-cased Daytonas, and we start to see an arms race through the next decade or so of these two watches.
Yeah, and again, chronographs became very famous to be tool watches, and again, the astronauts, all the race car drivers always had a chronograph of some sort. And these two were so iconic and really did battle each other out over the years. And the Rolex never became the biggest successful model they made. I mean, the Submariners were always much more desirable. That Daytona was always a niche piece, and probably why it took off so much later on.
And a lot of folks don't really realize that even though the Daytona is associated with motorsports and the Speedmaster is associated with aerospace, both of them did battle trackside during the late 60s. They were absolutely favorites of race drivers. You could also throw in the original Hoyer Carrera into that discussion. Correct. We had racing dial Omega Speedmaster moon watches. We had racers specials in the Daytona line like the 6262 and the 6264, which gave you the more modern movement inside, but gave you conventional pump pushers. So when the moment struck trackside, you'd, hang on, wait. Let me unscrew the crown, let me get that. The pump pusher advanced manual wind Daytonas were racetrack pieces, and Omega was there. Not known for it, but they were there at the time.
And again, it became so iconic and so famous in film, so famous in racing. It's just so fun to look back at these rivals back then and to look at them today and where it's developed into.
And it's fascinating because the movement's changed too, and a lot of folks don't really recognize this. We know that the caliber 861 arrived for the Moonwatch to replace the old La Manna 2310 base. A lot of folks don't realize that the Rolex caliber 727 in the late manual wind Daytonas had tons of changes compared to the Valjoux 72. Better finishing, better quality of wheels, free sprung, overcoil hairspring, all manner of upgrades, up to and including, in some cases, a chronometer certification and a higher beat rate than the earlier versions. So there was a change inside the watch. As much as we talk about the iconic designs of these watches, the rivalry was inside and outside.
Well, there's always been an evolution in Rolex, and that was always their attention to detail, was every year trying to make it a little better. And you'll see those variants through the years, which also helps the collectability because there were so many variants that were done for very short periods of time. And yes, at the time, almost everybody was using outsourced movements and then advancing them themselves and doing work on them in-house. Again, trying to make that base movement better so your watch you could promote as a better watch than your rival.
Yeah, it's fascinating because with the manual wind Daytonas over time, the movements became more sophisticated and refined and capable, and over time the Speedmaster movements became cheaper and easier to mass produce. So give me a quick snapshot of the market right now. I know you can go out and get a 10512 if you want for $15,000 to $20,000 in good shape. What would something like a 6240 cost today in this market?
Well, again, they'll range anywhere depending a lot on the dial. You know, the basic pieces are going to be somewhere in the 60 to 100 range. If you get into one of those racing dials, the Newman dials, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, it happens all the time. If you get a double sign dial, they can bring up to $1 million. It's the rarity, the special dials really do push that market. And we have seen some jump in Omegas on rarity. We had a big auction result just last year with a special Omega. So I think people are appreciating that more, but certainly Rolex in the secondary market far outweighs Omega.
Okay, going back to the future now, we're going to compare a modern watch, I believe, to another modern watch. You're going to get a little whiplash here, guys. Jumping forward, time warp, let's talk about the GMT, let's talk about an unlikely rival.
So the GMT, certainly one of my favorite Rolexes, and the modern Rolexes I think are amazing, and this particular piece has become just iconic. We're also talking about the Batman. I love the coloring, I love the movement, it's my typical daily driver, I love that watch. And it's become so iconic that you see copies in so many brands. Now, again, Omega's done a lot of things that have done it, but everybody from Tag Heuer to Bell & Ross happens to make a GMT that's black and blue today in the market. And there's so much has become iconic of that watch that it's almost overcopied, but I would argue unrivaled. It is, to me, one of the most perfect Rolexes, balance-wise. It's got a great history of the GMT-Master being the pilot's watch and being a dual time zone, and I just think it's one of the best watches they make today.
And I think the unlikely rivalry that emerges here, in keeping with today's theme, is that people compare it often to the Patek Philippe Aquanaut travel time. The 5164A is a watch that came out in 2011. It was the first ever dual time Aquanaut. It was considered by some to be the watch that really made the Aquanaut as a collection more than a junior Nautilus. You wouldn't think that a watch that retails for $40,000 would be compared to a watch that retails for just over $10,000, especially given that the pre-owned prices are about $150K for the Aquanaut and maybe $28,000 for the black and blue GMT. But in terms of size, movement specs, water resistance, fit, luminescence, people really do cross-shop them. People who can afford to spend anything on a watch are cross-shopping Rolex, Patek, and AP. And between Patek and Rolex, the GMT and the Aquanaut travel time are, they're as dissimilar as you can get in price, but people are cross-shopping them all the same.
Well, there's no question about it. And it really became that first sporty Patek that had some heft to it. It had a second function. It really wore nicely. I was never the biggest Aquanaut fan, especially on the early ones, but the 5164 is a great piece. And it really became for those guys who loved a sports watch, who wanted to be able to get it wet, and could afford and love Patek, it became a perfect alternative. And really, it did become a cross-shopping rival to a Rolex, which you wouldn't expect at all.
Now, the funny thing here is it's a little bit like the Wrangler and the Mercedes-Benz G-Class. You wouldn't think at face value, given their prices, people would cross-shop them. But people who don't pay attention to price say, well, that's Big Butch and goes well off-road, and this is Big Butch and goes well off-road. And they're doing the same thing. They're cross-shopping those, just like they're cross-shopping the Patek Aquanaut travel time and the GMT. And a lot of times, the GMT they want is either a black and blue or a Pepsi. They want it in steel.
Correct. Steel has become the favorite. It's a great watch, and it's a very interesting rivalry.
So, $28,000 for a steel GMT might seem crazy until you realize that people are cross-shopping it with a $150,000 used Aquanaut.
Which is still crazy, but it's an amazing market we learn.
And especially compared to like a Richard Mille, that's a hell of a discount, right guys? We just saved you a lot of money there. Okay, Mike, so I've got a few of my own, and I'm going to go back in time once more. This is the earliest watch we're discussing today, but we have a rivalry between Deadbeat seconds watches from the 1950s. Now, in 1952, Omega launched a watch called the Synchrobeat. It was a very limited edition run, crosshair dial, gold case, chronometer certification, and it was a Deadbeat second movement caliber 372. It was going to be an American market edition, a very expensive watch, because back then an adjusted multi-jewel chronometer certified watch sold in the American market was going to hit hellacious taxation. So Omega was really committed with this. They made 720 of them, and depending on who you believe, they may have recalled as many as 713 of them, leaving theoretically 17 in public hands. It had a problem with the movement. It was lubrication related. So today, this is considered to be a blue chip investment. What people don't realize is not only is it comparable to other Omegas of the period like the Constellation, the DeVilles, and the Seamasters, but it's got a natural rival at Rolex, the Truebeat.
Yes.
Now, in 1954, shortly after the Synchrobeat debacle, Rolex, which saw this trend coming, decided it needed a Deadbeat second watch. Now, a lot of brands were into deadbeat seconds back then. Omega, Rolex, even Doxa was in on it. Chazard created the calibers 115 and 116 so that other brands could buy off-the-shelf deadbeat second watches. Whether they were for technicians or doctors, as was sometimes said, it wasn't really clear. What we know is that they were cool, they were quirky, and they were all proximate to that mid-50s time frame. So the 6556 TrueBeat was comparable in many ways to the Synchrobeat. Both of them were tiny. The Rolex was 64 millimeters, the Omega was 35. Both of them were chronometers, both of them were deadbeats, and both of them were built in really, really low numbers, and both of them had mechanical problems.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I think back to deadbeats, and it's funny, a lot of people kind of forgot how important deadbeat was back then, and it was more, I think it was doctors, but it was also like engineers, guys who were just precise, wanted to see that hitting. And then when the quartz craze came on, that was the attraction of quartz, was you could see it hit, and everybody was like, oh, I wouldn't want a deadbeat because it just looks like a quartz. So deadbeat kind of went off the shelf, I think, for 25, 30 years, and then people were rediscovering these early mechanical deadbeats. They were hard to do. They did take a lot of issues with them in the movements, but it's an amazing, rare piece, again, that was unappreciated for generations.
Yeah, it's important to note just how rare the 6556 is. A deadbeat seconds watch with a unique caliber 1040 over time with a lack of parts and expertise. Many of those were converted back to the 1030 on which they were based. So you can find a lot of true beats today, but most of them don't actually beat true. Now there was another non-chronometer certified version of this that wasn't labeled true beat on the dial in some case, and that was the 6558 built into the early 60s. Both of these watches are rare. Not terribly hard to find one, but if you find one that still has the TrueBeat parts, be prepared to pay. And if you find one of those 17 Omegas, be prepared to pay more. Okay, crazy stuff in the world of deadbeat second watches. They were at one time, like you said, almost a dead breed. They're coming back now. But there's always been a niche for engineers and technician watches. And from the mid-50s, we started to see a flowering of watches designed for people who worked in what was called big science at the time. The public-private partnerships where government money and private research labs started accelerating the growth of fundamental R&D in the mid-50s. Rolex was in on it, Omega was in on it, JLC was in on it, Patek Philippe was in on it, and many more. So let's take a look at the first generation Rolex Milgauss, the 6543, the 6541, and compare them to the IWC Ingenieur. Mike, what can you tell me about the original Milgauss watches?
So the original Milgausses were made very much for specialists because they could withstand magnetic fields. And again, very emerging science, a lot of technology going on, and the watches they were wearing were just going off kilter because of the magnetism. So they developed these movements, but again, very niche product, more expensive than the traditional pieces because of the extra mechanics involved. And then it was just an unusual watch to have. So again, rare piece, really cool, very specialized, which again, back when Rolex started, they were tool watches. And that was the original thing. You had a diver's watch, you had a watch for magnetic fields, you had a chronograph. You had very specialized things, not because of colors, not for fashion reasons, but really functional tools. And that's really where they developed, and everybody else was seeing this, and a watch really was built to be that tool, especially in that period.
And the thing about the original Milgauss is it's very different than today's Milgauss. The first generation watches had honeycomb dials that were made up of copper laminates that would help to guard against the magnetic flux that could cause error in the operation. They had rotating bezels like Rolex dive watches and pilot's watches. They did actually have one element, the 6541, which oddly enough was the second of them. The 6543 came first. But the 6541 got a lightning bolt seconds hand that is still with us in the Milgauss.
And I love that lightning bolt second hand because to me, it was the first time Rolex did something on a watch that wasn't necessarily just functional, but it was kind of a cool touch of color. It had some character to it. And it was the first time I think we saw in their production that they put in a piece with that lightning bolt hand, which is awesome, that really developed, and you see those touches in the current collection.
Now, the IWC was important because on paper it had the same anti-magnetism as the Rolex, but from a rivalry standpoint, the IWC was 36.5 millimeters and it had a very vintage look, traditional lugs, traditional crown, traditional round case. The Rolex was a 38 millimeter and it had a large tonneau-like oyster profile, a robust screw-down crown. It was altogether a more, one might say, sports-oriented design, whereas the IWC was very much like a vintage dress watch that had been made anti-magnetic. The larger, burlier Rolex was very much in the mold of a modern sports watch, so you need to take that into account. Looking back, obviously, the IWC was not the investment buy. Today, you can find them for $15,000 to $20,000 in great shape, whereas first-generation Milgauss, what am I going to pay, Mike?
Find one, but I mean, they're going to be big numbers, as you've seen with a lot of these vintage models. And the Milgauss, especially when you talk about the rotating bezel, we all forget that, and there's a lot of speculation today that maybe when they do get rid of the current model Milgauss, maybe we'll go back to the traditional thing. But the market has really swallowed all of those up. I haven't even seen them hit the market lately.
You could pay up to $300,000 for a first-generation Milgauss in the right shape, with the right documentation, provenance. That's a serious piece of real estate on your wrist. Just remember, if you're looking at engineers' watches from the 50s, Rolex has quite a few rivals. Now, we're moving forward, and we're going to consider something from the late 60s, early 70s, and another one of those no comparisons between brands. Because when we talk Beta 21s, we're talking a lot of brands, among them Rolex and Patek Philippe. So in 1969, Patek Philippe launched the 3587. It was huge for the time for a dress watch. 42.5 millimeters, powered by the Beta 21 first generation quartz movement. 1 year later, Rolex, using the identical Beta 21, launched the Rolex 5100. Like the Patek, big, precious metal, integrated bracelet, and according to research by Rolex expert James Dowling, actually an early Genta design with integrated bracelet. So you wind up comparing the Rolex 5100, nicknamed the Texan, and it fits because everything's bigger in Texas, and this is a big watch, with the even bigger Patek Philippe Beta 21 3587. And Mike, I think this is probably the only time in history a Patek Philippe and a Rolex shared the exact same movement. I mean, how do you even compare watches like this?
Well, it's interesting because back then, this was changing technology. And a lot of the brands, specifically Rolex and Patek, we're working on this together. They did some of these clocks that were mechanical. John Reardon just showed us one last week where he had a Patek clock, the early quartz pieces, with a Rolex on the dial because they did them for Rolex. So they worked together on some of these evolutions, but it was such a step out for Patek Philippe, especially of the time. I mean, you think of early dress Pateks, and they're so thin and delicate and just elegant. And the Beta 21 is just the opposite. It is big, burlies, kind of 70s feel, and I love it. And I really believe the Rolex kind of coined that term of the Texas Timex because they were so big and so prevalent in that market. And it's just an awesome piece when you see it today.
Yeah, this watch was just off the scale. Not only was it huge for a dress watch back then, but the watch was rare. It was a 1,000-piece limited edition, one of very few limited editions Rolex ever created. It had an early use of a sapphire crystal. When you bought the watch, your name was included on a special register at Rolex in case you ever showed up to visit. It was nicknamed the Texan, and it fits. ZZ Top, great Texas band, they had that song Tush. Billy F. Gibbons, he said it's not what you think it is. The word tush in Texas means really opulent, really luxurious, really cushy. And the Rolex Texan was absolutely tush by that standard. What's the market like for these? White gold, yellow gold, both rare. If you find one, what are you going to pay?
Well, it's interesting because we actually have a yellow gold version that I picked up a few months ago that's being restored right now. And they really haven't gone crazy in the scale of Rolex watches. I mean, it's going to be in the $30,000 to $40,000 range for that kind of thing. And when you look at it, and as you spoke of, the 1,000-piece limited, they're all hand engraved on the back, which again, very rare for Rolex. Most of it is done very regimented and thing. This was kind of their elegant, high-end, just beautiful watch. And I love that thing. And the Beta 21 Pateks, again, those have gone crazy, and especially with the funky bracelets.
The
Like
Swiss cheese bracelet.
The Swiss cheese bracelet is one of the coolest Pateks you'll ever see.
I think it's also worth mentioning that although 1,000 pieces might sound really limited, and it is for Rolex, you have to remember that the best estimate for the Beta 21 was that 6,000 movements were made, meaning theoretically 1 in every 6 Beta 21 movements was a Rolex 5100, which means in this case, the Patek Philippe actually has rarity on its side, with no more than 100 to 200 of any given version, white gold, yellow gold, actually made. So guys, the choice is yours, Rolex or Patek Philippe. You get the same movement either way, and this watch can speak for itself. Hold the Beta 21 up to your ear, it vibrates like an Accutron.
They're amazing movements, and they really are character and style, and each one of them is very special in the case design and the bracelets. They're great pieces, and again, I think still underappreciated. I think they've got a lot of way to run.
Well, this was Rivalries Day on Around the Crown. We've made our cases, and now you're the judge and jury. Time out, Tim out, Mike out. Thanks for logging on.
Thanks, Tim.